So imagine if you were the only person that showed up to church today. Has anybody ever been the only person in a church service? I read a story just a few weeks ago of a man, a journalist, who was the only person when he went to church. And so he reflected about what that experience was like and what it meant to him. He's a journalist living in Portland, Maine, and he says that he felt an urge, a need to get into the church that day. He had been visiting this Episcopal church in town for many years, off and on, more off than on. And so he said he got up. It was a cold night. He wanted to go to the evening service. It was raining. It was a dismal day out in Portland, Maine, he said, but he got on his coat and his boots. He found his way to the cathedral. He walked in, and he looked around, and there was nobody else there. And he thought, well, gosh, am I there at the wrong time? Check the order of service, and it was the right time. And he thought, well, maybe my watch is off. And he looked and saw that his watch was right, and he was just really confused. But he thought, all right, I'll stay. So he walked down, and he sat kind of in the front, where I guess that's where you sit when no one else is in church. And he sat there, and he said the priest walked out, and she looked at him and said, let's give it 5 more minutes. And so she was dressed in her civilian clothes and looking at him and said, let's give it a couple more minutes and we'll see how this thing works out. They waited 5 minutes, and he was still the only one. And so she said, well, let's get started. I'll go put on my vestments. I'll be back in a minute. She goes and she puts on her clerical attire and her vestments, and she comes out and she begins the liturgy. The same liturgy in the Episcopal Church that follows the Book of Common Prayer, just like it would if there were 500 people in that sanctuary. But she said, I don't have a reader today. Would you do the readings for me? He said, sure. He said he got up and he kind of stood in the pews and had the Bible, and she called out the verses to him. And there were 2 passages that he found particularly challenging that day. One was from Ecclesiastes, and those of you who are familiar with this book know that it's not a comforting spiritual book. It's written by an author referred to as the cynic. And it starts off saying, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Where will I find any meaning in this life at all? The author of the text goes through and says, well, I tried pleasure. I drank a lot of wine. I had a lot of sensual pleasure. I ate a lot of good food. I built a magnificent house. And you know what? I still feel kind of empty, and I think I'm going to die. So then he looks and says, well, maybe it's wisdom. And he reads the books of the ages and recites poetry and verses of Scripture. And he goes and meets with really wise people and says, well, they're really thoughtful and wise, but I think we're all still going to die. And it rains on the wicked and the just, and it rains on smart people and ignorant people, and the sun shines on all of us, so that can't be the only thing. Then the author looks to the value of work and says, well, maybe it's hard work or the accumulation of wealth. He says, well, the sun shines on the rich and the poor, the lazy and the determined. The sun rises every day no matter what. And I think we're all going to die. So the author of the text says, and I saw that all was vanity. And the only thing I could decide to do was to eat, drink, be merry, and try to be happy with the remaining few days that my God has given me. So this guy sitting alone, kind of sad in church, and reads this line out and says, well, that's not very helpful. The next reading is this passage from Matthew, one of Jesus' parables, where he talks about this guy who's a really hard worker, stores up a lot of grain and goods, and he's determined. He's got kind of that Protestant work ethic, and he gets too much grain before there were Protestants, and he gets a lot of grain and fills it up in a barn, and that barn won't hold it, and so he builds a bigger barn and fills that one up with grain, and in a dream, God visits the man and goes, you fool, I might take your life from you tonight. What are you doing storing up all of that stuff? And so here's that man in Portland alone in the church again going, well, vanity of vanities, all is vanity, and God might take my life tonight. Thanks. He says the priest comes down instead of having a sermon, and she says, why don't we just talk, huh? She sits in the pew and asks him who he is, why he's in church, and then says, how are those readings for you? He says, not very helpful, thank you very much, and I'm uncomfortable. And so they have this really good conversation about where you find comfort in uncomfortable times. Where do you find your grounding when you feel like the foundation is coming out under you and your society? Where do you turn to when you're scared or feeling alone or feeling like you're not capable enough? He says it was really helpful. He told her that the church was his grounding in moments like that, even though he hadn't been there in a year. He said it helped. He went off into the night, raining in Portland, as happy that he had showed up as he thought he might be, even though he was the only one. Now that scenario of one person alone in a church with a priest is the scary thing that we were taught was going to happen to American religion in the time that we went to seminary. I went to seminary in 2004. So from that moment to now, I have been taught at every conference, every major lecture, most books on American religion, that my job was going to disappear before I was done with it. Oh. That church as we know it was doomed and dying, that the pews were going to be empty. Well, that's not entirely true today. But our Episcopal colleagues and a lot of our mainline Protestant colleagues are facing a rapid decline in their membership and attendance. Even when humanists and atheists and agnostics, which there's plenty of us here in the room here, but people who don't want to do church organized, they kind of do it like church. There's a group called the Sunday Assembly, which is an atheist church. And it gathers and people sit in chairs and somebody speaks and they sing songs and they offer meditations but not prayers. It kind of still looks like what we're doing. I get the sense that even if the doom that was promised me happened, even if it was one person every week, that those questions that man was addressing and the author of Ecclesiastes was addressing and I'm wrestling with in my life, those central spiritual questions wouldn't go away. Now, there are many important questions in the spiritual life, but some of the ones I wrestle with the most and I think are that overlap in every tradition are, do I belong in the family of all things? Am I supposed to be here? Do I belong in creation or not? And if I do, where do I belong? The second question is, does my life matter and make a difference? And what are its limits? And the third is, what is worthy of my life's great yes, like the poem suggested? If my life does make a difference, and if I do belong, what is worthy of the attention and love of my life? For me, no matter what context you're in, those are the major questions that a spiritual life addresses. Do I belong in the family of all things? Does my life make a difference? And what is worthy of the love and service of my one life? Now, the tradition that we come out of, Unitarian Universalism, has answered those questions. Our Unitarian and Universalist ancestors said, you do belong in the fabric of creation. Humans are not a mistake. Your flesh and your body is not sinful, it's good. So good, in fact, the Unitarians said, that God dwells in you. The Universalists said that not only were you damned, not damned. Watch out. They said not only are you not damned, but you never were in trouble to begin with. Never were in trouble to begin with. You're not in trouble now, and you won't be in trouble. And so both of them, because they believed that humans were good, or at least would be reunited with God forever, they both had a real this-worldly faith. They said, you're right, your life makes a difference. Not only does your life make a difference, you had better make a difference right now. There was an imperative to do so right now. And our tradition for the last 100 years or so has said the things that deserve the great yes of your life are love and justice, to varying degrees. So here I stand. I went to seminary. I learned all this stuff. My tradition has said that I do belong in the great family of all things. I am literally related to trees and stars. That my life makes a difference, and I had better start acting like it now. And that the things that are worthy of the love of my one life are love and justice and some other things. And that's great to know. I like knowing that. I like saying it. The words are pretty. But knowing that and practicing that are two completely different things. And for me, I need spiritual disciplines in my life because knowing that I belong and I'm worthy of love, that my life makes a difference, and I should give it to love and justice, and actually getting through the gap to do that, I can't do that by going to church once a year. It just won't work for me. The difference between your opinion or your philosophy and your spiritual practice is practice. It's kind of like knowing that broccoli is good for you. It's good for you. I know that. And then there's eating it. We can all say love is good. And then there's cultivating the regular daily, weekly, monthly practices that help me become more loving. It's kind of like the difference between reading a menu and eating food. And Unitarian Universalists, boy howdy, do we like to read a menu. Let's go to that compassion seminar. Oh, that lecture on generosity. That was good stuff, wasn't it? You want me to do what? It's not just us. But progressives do have a way of putting things in the abstract. For me, the difference between the person I am and the person I'm called to be is practice. The gap between the man I am and the man I might be is practice. So here in our church, we kind of talk about spiritual disciplines having a regular order of things you might imagine. We talk about having a daily discipline, meditation or prayer or journaling, a weekly practice of coming to worship, a monthly practice of joining in a small reflective group of people who will actually listen to you, a yearly retreat, and a lifetime pilgrimage. That's kind of the plan we lay out when people ask us. And if you go to the spiritual practice class that's being offered, and I would advise that you do it, it's a really great resource. You'll learn what it means for Unitarians to pray or to meditate, to journal, or to engage in Lectio Divina, holy reading. The point for me of doing any of it is to move myself from knowing that I belong, that my life matters, knowing what I should give my life to, and actually doing it. And to be honest with you, right now, I'm not doing it. My spiritual practice is totally dried up right now. Maybe it's having a 2-month-old and a 4-year-old at home who eat time. Maybe it is the holidays, which are real busy for ministers. I don't know, but I could blame it on all that stuff. But I haven't sat down on the mat and meditated or prayed in weeks. And I can tell the difference. I can tell the difference. I'm less patient, much crabbier, more judgmental. Well, there's a whole list of stuff. I won't give you the whole list. But I can feel the difference. I can feel the difference. And I know that for me, when I have ecstatic religious experiences, they don't happen often. Maybe once a year, where I feel like I've been picked up and rung like a bell. I only get those when I've been doing my work. Maybe you get them out of the blue, and I'm good for you, but not me. When I suddenly feel like I am at one with all creation, it usually happens when I've been sitting on the mat and praying or meditating every day for a good 6 months. When I feel like I'm actually forgiving, it happens because I've been practicing doing things intentionally trying to be more forgiving. And the difference between those things really is intention. Because for me, a spiritual practice is an intentional, meaningful relationship with reality itself. So think of it like Russian nesting dolls. Here's me, and then there's a bigger reality, and a bigger reality, and a bigger reality. Whatever the biggest one is that I can imagine. Some people call it God, or the universe, or creation, or the mystery. How do I cultivate a meaningful reality with the biggest one I'm held in? Yoga might be your spiritual practice, but it's not unless it is. Does that make sense? Two people doing yoga in the same room, one of them might be doing it because it makes them feel relaxed, or getting toned, or getting better balance, and that's a good thing. But the person who says doing this practice grounds me in the fragility of a human body, reminding me that I will one day die, and when I experience the pain of aching muscles, I remember to be compassionate and bless those around me. And I do that every day to remind me of that. That's a spiritual practice. Just because you do it every day doesn't make it a spiritual practice. I used to jog most days, and that wasn't my spiritual practice. It's good for me, but it didn't intentionally ground me in what it meant to be a human and guide me toward what a proper use of my life would be. I asked some of my friends this week what the difference it made in their life was. And a buddy of mine got back to me with a particularly poignant answer. He's a friend of mine going back many years who has struggled with anger and serious addiction. He's gotten in trouble with the law on a number of occasions. And he made a decision that he wanted to turn his life around. And that decision came in joining a Buddhist Sangha, a group of meditators. He wrote back to me and he said, every day when I sit on the mat, I remember that all things are impermanent, that I will one day die, that my anger is impermanent, and so is my joy, that the compassion that I have is impermanent, that the suffering of others is impermanent, and that the only response is mindfulness and compassion. I find that I pay attention to others' needs more than my own, and I'm more able to love people now than I ever have been in my life. That counts as his spiritual practice. He's a different person. I think that's the difference. Ask yourself if coming to this church for 5 minutes, 15 years, 50 years has helped you answer the question, do I belong? Does my life make a difference? And what is worthy of my life's love? Because the stakes really are incredibly high. It's not just about being relaxed or feeling good, having lower blood pressure, or all the things spiritual disciplines do, and they do those. It's about knowing that there is often a big gap between the people we are and the people we're called to be. Like Anne Lamott said in her reading, you can really tell that the people you value in your life have practiced being that way. The poem stated this morning that you can watch and see the difference between the person who has answered the great yes to life or the great no. I hope that we are the people that others can tell have answered the great yes. That we're the kind of people who stand out as not being okay with just knowing that justice is good, but people who will refuse to live without practicing it. That we will not be content having seminars on compassion, but practicing every day being compassionate people. People in the world will know us by the fruits of our actions and not our words alone. The stakes are the people we are called to be. And sometimes, as the reading stated, we look at the mat or the pew, kind of like a dog looking at the vet with a needle. It's going to be good for us, and we don't totally understand it, but we didn't like it last time, and it hurt, but I feel okay now. It really does work. And in my life, I look back at you and see that my life with you has made me more compassionate, made me more loving, made me more patient and kind, and it has taken a lot of work. I hope it works for you too. May it be so. Amen.